Okay, we're back and ready to talk about the rest of Slaughterhouse-Five, and because it doesn't go in any kind of order, we're going to talk about parts from all over the book in no particular order because there's no particular order to go in, which is kind of the point. But first, let's have Dr. McFall give us an overview of what happened in Dresden.
So the simple so maybe the way to approach this is to point out the question, right? What happened in Dresden? What happened in Dresden is simple, and that is that there are a series of 3 bombing raids. Remember that the British and the Americans are allies, and so the RAF, the Royal Air Force, which is the British version of the U.S. Army Air Corps, are cooperating in the air campaign over Germany. And in February of 1945, they launched 3 raids. The first by 244 Lancasters, which is the RAF version or equivalent of the B-17, which dropped 800 tons of bombs in 40 minutes. Followed shortly thereafter by 529 more, dropping another 1,800 tons. And finally, 311 B-17s dropping 771 tons. The result of this is something that is both colloquially and technically known as a firestorm. Right? In other words, the whole city simply lights on fire. And the physics of this, of course, means that there's an enormous wind that emerges from this and makes it incredibly difficult for people to escape. There's a huge argument about casualties, but I think most historians will settle on somewhere between 25,000 and 35,000 people killed. Remember, the proportion of killed to wounded or injured is always 1 to something bigger than 1, right? So when you're talking about, again, just 30,000 people killed, you're almost certainly talking about 80 or 90 or 100,000 people injured. In a firestorm, that means people with third-degree burns over 80% of their body, means people whose lives are never going to be the same. That's what happened in Dresden. That's the explanation, or that's the answer, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, or at least for most people, and I think in a lot of ways for Vonnegut, that's not the right question, right? The right question is, why did that happen? And that's a more complicated question to answer. And here you have to remember that the Americans and the British have been bombing Germany ever since, well, the British since 1940, the Americans since they joined the war in 1942. They had both of them wanted to bomb Germany to win the war, but they had slightly different views of how to do this. The Americans tended to believe that the way to do this was to destroy German industry. The British tended to believe that the way to do this was to destroy the morale of the German population.
Does that have anything to do with the fact that they have been dropping bombs on London?
That's part of it.
Rockets
that is part of it.
For exactly that purpose?
That's part of it.
Okay.
Part of it is the result of the fact that the British are simply more realistic about their technological limitations than the Americans are. And so they figure out that they can't fly over Germany in the daytime. They have to do it at night. They therefore can't bomb accurately. And the conclusion then is partly, we got to get those bastards anyway because they're getting us. And partly, well, these guys can't work if they can't sleep. So if we just keep them up all night and destroy their houses and destroy their neighborhoods, they won't be effective laborers. The kind of compromise they come up with, which isn't really a compromise, it's we're going to do our thing, you do your thing, and maybe they'll work together, is that the Americans do their strategy in the daytime, the British do their strategy at nighttime, and once in a while they work together. By late 1944, everybody knew the war was coming to a close. The question is how quickly. And the how quickly part is really critically important because what that translates into is how many Americans and British and Russians are going to die in the process of bringing the war to an end. And most of the strategic evaluations said that the length of the war depended on how effectively the Germans could prevent the Soviet assault of the East from advancing. And they had intelligence that there were German military forces moving from the West to the East. They also have intelligence saying that there are civilian refugees fleeing from the east to the west. One of the transportation nodes for both of those groups is Dresden, which had been largely untouched until then. The
And was
German-
it?
yeah.
I've heard that it was somehow an agreed upon safe city.
This is what the Germans believe.
Okay.
This is not actually true. But there's a widespread belief in Germany that this is a city of great culture.
Mhm.
And if you go to Dresden today, you see that, right? And that's why people go to Dresden.
And you just
today.
went to Dresden.
I just went to Dresden. We're hopeful that we will have some pictures of Dresden to show you as it looks today. But you go to Dresden because of the beautiful churches, because of the art museums, because of the architecture. It's kind of, politically, it's really not all that important. It's kind of like Kansas City or Oklahoma City, right? It's a regional city. But in terms of the culture, it's a world-class city. And the Germans thought that's why the Allies weren't bombing it.
Okay.
In fact, the Allies weren't bombing it because it was too far away and because they didn't think it was industrially significant enough. And so there is this sense among the Germans that if you can just get through into Dresden, you'll be safe at least for a moment. Right. The Allies chose to bomb Dresden as a way, they thought, of accelerating the victory of the war by destroying this transportation node and making it more difficult for the Germans to contest the Soviet advance. They don't intend to create a firestorm. This happens, maybe not accidentally, but as a result of a logical set of tactics that were intended, a natural result of a set of tactics that are actually intended to achieve a different end. Right? This had happened once before in Germany, happened in Hamburg, and they didn't really learn the lessons of this. For instance, one of the lessons of Hamburg is that if you're going to do pinpoint daylight bombing of factories, you can't do it after the city has been set ablaze. And they did it in the wrong order in Dresden, and so the Americans can't see their targets, and so they just kind of lob their bombs into the center of Dresden and accentuate this firestorm. It is not, as we mentioned in the last time, right? It is not the most costly bombing raid. Even with conventional weapons, right? So in the Pacific Theater in March of 1945, after the Allied forces led by a guy named Curtis LeMay, who's an Air Force general, decided to change tactics and try, in fact, to burn cities down. Raid in Tokyo kills something like 100,000 people. Okay. But it is an iconic raid, right? It is the one that people remember, probably because the victims are white Europeans, and probably because of the kind of press it got at the end of the war.
Now, I've always heard Dresden, I mean, in my experience, Dresden has always been a rhetorical ploy. Whenever anybody's talking about nuclear disarmament, people will say, well, okay, you get rid of all of the nuclear weapons, but remember Dresden. We killed all of these people. We had this great firestorm, and we did it without nuclear weapons. So you shouldn't be so worried about nuclear weapons.
That's a nice thought, and it is true, right? In one sense, there is nothing to complain about. The difference is that Dresden took, I'm doing the math quickly in my head, something like 800 of the most advanced technological achievements of the time, right? 4-engine bombers. And again, I'm trying to do the math in my head, but thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of high explosive. And my guess is, given standard tactics, another 100 or 200 fighter planes as escorts, and could not be done until the end of the war because of all of the earlier bombardments and missions. It is true. I mean, conventional bombing killed hundreds of thousands of people, but it did so over the space of 4 years with an enormous amount of effort, whereas Hiroshima kills about 100,000 people in 5 minutes.
Right. But that rhetorical belief actually does make it into Slaughterhouse 5,
Mm-hmm.
because when one of Billy Pilgrim's time leaps, he's in a hospital with somebody who is reading a book, which I guess actually is a book, called The Destruction of Dresden by David Irving.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm actually looking at the cover of the book on my computer. David Irving is a very famous historian, somebody who started out writing pretty traditional historical work and evolved through the course of his work to somebody who has come to the conclusion that the Holocaust, as we understand it as a concept, really didn't exist, and that we need to recognize German pain as equivalent to that, or roughly equivalent to that of the people the Germans killed, and that we need to be far more sympathetic for the Nazi regime and ideology than we are.
That's not a real popular viewpoint today.
No, in fact, there's a famous trial of 3 or 4 years ago where he's tried in British court for slander as part of this campaign.
But in this book, and Vonnegut appears to be quoting directly here, I'm on page 240 in my version. The advocates of nuclear disarmament seem to believe that if they could achieve their aim, war would become tolerable and decent. They would do well to read this book and ponder the fate of Dresden, where 135,000 people died as the result of an air attack with conventional weapons. On the night of March 9th, 1945, an air attack on Tokyo by American heavy bombers using incendiary and high explosive bombs caused the deaths of 83,793 people. The atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima killed 71,379 people. So
the statistics here, right? Statistics can be made to tell the story you want, right? And those are roughly the same, right? The difference between my stats and his stats roughly amount to when you have the cutoff period for the deaths directly resulting to these bombs, right? As opposed to 2 weeks later or something like that. But the point he's making doesn't change from that, right? And again, this is a fundamentally anti-war novel.
And Vonnegut is, through his satire and through his characters, he's very strongly objecting to this use of Dresden, wouldn't you say?
Mm-hmm.
He's putting this out here as one of the ways to shape the history of Dresden. Another way was Roland Weary's way of the macho American soldiers and the Three Musketeers. Well, here's a traditional history book that by somebody who wasn't there, that takes Dresden as a sort of abstract set of statistics that can be used to make an argument for the point that we really shouldn't worry very much about nuclear disarmament. And and this seems to drive Vonnegut crazy.
Mm-hmm. And here's maybe a useful point to kind of touch back again to the discussion we had about Manchester and about history and literature, right? Because there is a difference between historians' approach to the subject and literary, but it doesn't have to do with truth, I would argue. I think it has to do with your responsibility to be accurate, right? And Irving is a good example, especially in his early work. Maybe not later, but in his early work. Irving does his research. He gets his facts right, and that is an obligation of historians, is to be as accurate as you could possibly be, recognizing the limits of that possibility. But you can use the material that is accurate to craft narratives which have different kinds of truth in them.
Yeah. The different, and this has come up over and over again. Accuracy is not truth.
Yeah, that's right.
The statistics are correct. The application here is exactly the opposite of Vonnegut's.
And here, Manchester, by framing his work as a memoir, relieves himself of the need for accuracy, and thus allows him to, I don't know if ethical is the right word, but we'll use it ethically, kind of insert these scenes of combat in places where they didn't happen in order to craft the narrative he wants. A historian would object if presenting this as history would not work because it's not accurate. But broadly speaking, both historians and memoirists and novelists all try and craft narratives of truth. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, historians are no different than novelists.
And Vonnegut seems to be saying, well, okay, I'm going to give you not accurate. I'm going to give you space aliens. I'm going to give you time travel. But I'm going to give you truth.
Yeah.
And kind of going along with this, probably the most famous passage in Slaughterhouse-Five, one that comes up over and over again. As a matter of fact, a guy named Martin Amis wrote a wonderful book called Time's Arrow that is based just on this passage. And this is on my page 93. It's the passage where Billy Pilgrim is watching a war movie, and at the TV station, because this was before there were VCRs, the tape somehow plays backwards, so he ends up watching it backwards. It was a movie about the American bombers in the Second World War and the gallant men who flew them.
And that adjective is important. right? So we'll talk about it in a minute, but note the adjective as you read this passage.
Gallant.
Gallant, yeah.
Seen backwards by Billy, the story went like this. American planes full of holes and wounded men and corpses took off backwards from an airfield in England. Over France, a few German fighter planes flew with them backwards, sucked bullets and shell fragments from some of the planes and crewmen, and they did the same for wrecked American bombers on the ground, and those planes flew up backwards to join the formation. The formation flew backwards over a German city that was in flames. The bombers opened their bomb bay doors, exerted a miraculous magnetism which shrunk the fires, gathered them into cylindrical steel containers, and lifted the containers into the bellies of the planes. The containers were stored neatly in racks. The Germans below had miraculous devices of their own, which were long steel tubes that they used to suck more fragments from the crewmen and planes. But there were still a few wounded Americans, though, and some of the bombers were in bad repair. Over France, German fighters came up again and made everything and everybody as good as new. So here we have this wonderful story of cooperation and interdependence, and the story backwards is a much better story than the story forwards. Now, the Martin Amis novel I was talking about, Time's Arrow, is about a man who somehow there is an element of him that observes his life backwards, and it seems perfectly normal, and it's very, very disalienating. Until we get back to the World War II period, where it turns out he was a Nazi doctor. And so throughout World War II, he's healing people. He's healing children and taking their taking their pains away. And the viewer element is just amazed at what a great doctor he is. Well, of course, that's this message is the same, that this is exactly the opposite of what. So it's not just wrong; it's exactly wrong. And if you just play it backwards, it makes perfect sense. And so the joke of Time's Arrow is that when we get to World War II, it looks like a forward narrative of a doctor healing people.
I've not read it. I need to.
Yeah.
Because to me, the everything about this story is embedded in that word gallant, right?
Okay.
Because the traditional war narrative, gallant means courageous, but it also means that you kill a lot of people.
Yeah.
And here he has reframed that word to say that gallantry really means healing people and making the world safer.
Everything is beautiful and nothing hurts. Great line from the novel. Just a couple more things we want to talk about here. One is Kilgore Trout.
Yeah.
And as I said before, Kilgore Trout appears in some form in almost every Vonnegut novel. He's kind of an alter ego for Kurt Vonnegut. He's also based on the science fiction novelist Theodore Sturgeon.
No, I didn't know that.
Just the name.
Huh.
Kilgore,
okay.
Theodore, Sturgeon, Trout.
Huh.
But Kilgore Trout is an awfully bad novelist whose work only appears in pornographic magazines. And one of the characters, Elliot Rosewater, who's my favorite Vonnegut book, by the way, is the book about him. So God bless you, Mr. Rosewater. But he's a great fan of Kilgore Trout, and he goes into all of these adult bookstores looking for Kilgore Trout's novels and stories in these pornographic magazines. And the joke with Kilgore Trout is he's a great scenarist. He creates great scenarios, but he's a terrible writer. So we just get these one-paragraph novels, and we get several of them throughout here. And throughout Vonnegut, every one of his novels has some summarized Kilgore Trout novels. One of them is an alternative gospel where Jesus is a nobody. He's a bum. He's not divine at all. And people kill him because he's a pain in the neck. And at that moment, God adopts him and says, "This is my son that you killed. Never do this again. Treat everybody like he's my son." And all of a sudden, you get Christianity expanded from the divinity of Jesus into the divinity of everybody. And it's a wow moment. And the other one is the story of the money tree. There's a tree that has money and jewels as its fruit, and it's a really effective tree because people go there and kill each other and they die, and it makes good fertilizer. So these are these are just, they're not novels. They're plots for stories that wouldn't even make good novels, but they make great one-sentence or one-paragraph summaries of novels.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's the other novelist here.
Yeah.
Vonnegut, Roland Weary, David Irving to an extent, and now Kilgore Trout are all making stories out of memories. So last question, because we are coming down low on time again, is why the space alien stuff? I mean, it's not even necessary to the time plot, because the Tralfamadorians, they don't make Billy Pilgrim come unstuck in time. That happens for no particular reason. But they do explain what happened to him. So why in this story do we need that added plot element of space aliens from Tralfamador?
So I'll reflect this back to you. But so one possible answer, I suppose, is to get the weird kind of scene where Billy Pilgrim is in the zoo with
Montana Wild.
With Montana, yes, with
Yes.
the porn star.
Yeah.
But in a lot of, so that's, I guess, a way to the answer was that this allows you to see humans from somebody else's perspective.
Exactly right, I think. One of the standard devices of satire is called defamiliarization. And this is where you take something familiar and you view it from an angle that makes it look odd. And what you realize then is that it's always been odd. You've just become accustomed to it. So one of the devices of satire is to try to push you out of what you've become accustomed to so you can see the things that you do from a perspective that it doesn't seem normal to you. And for Gulliver's Travels, one of the great satirical works, this is the function of the Broadbignagians, the giants who Gulliver's trying to convince them what a great idea gunpowder is, because you can blow things up and kill people and win wars, and they're absolutely horrified by this. And all of a sudden, the judgment of somebody who's not already acculturated to war and gunpowder and explosives, it really does look kind of stupid. So the satirist is always trying to get you to see yourself from that perspective. Sometimes I call this the anthropologist from Mars. Imagine if an anthropologist from Mars came down and looked at a football game. What would that being see? Or looked at a university tenure system. How would that look if this weren't so normal to you? How weird would it look to somebody else? So the Tralfamadorians for Vonnegut play that role in looking at war and also looking at the way that human beings experience time
And meaning.
Because
We frame, so often we create meaning because of our sense of time.
Because these are beings that don't live sequentially in time. They see all moments as moments, and they all live like Billy Pilgrim, basically. They know how the world's going to end. One of them is going to, blow up the whole universe in some experiment, and Billy says, "Well, why don't you just stop it?" And they say, "Well, you can't. It's what it is. It's the moment of time." So that's he's not really trying to tell us there aren't Tralfamadorians. He's trying to get us to understand the way that we experience time and make meaning from the perspective of somebody who doesn't do it like that. And how does that play, do you think, with the Dresden narrative?
That's an interesting question. For one, what he's doing with the book is quite clearly trying to get you to experience the Dresden narrative from a different perspective. And so that's one way it is. Another way is to get a feel for the absurdity and the lack of meaning that comes from this, right? Because again, these traditional narratives are always trying to attach meaning to this. And again, he will give you a feel for the way in which those narratives don't work. And the novel, actually, right after The Money Tree, you get a real feel for this. I'm looking for it now. I think the Gutless Wonder. Yes, the Gutless Wonder, about a robot who had bad breath, who became popular after halitosis was cured. Robots dropped jellied gasoline. We would talk about that as napalm. Right. Robots did the dropping. They had no conscience and no circuits, which would allow them to imagine what was happening to the people on the ground. Trout's leading robot looked like a human being and could talk and dance and so on and go out with the girls, and no one held it against him that he dropped jellied gasoline on people, but they found his halitosis unforgivable.
Oh my gosh. Yeah,
Yeah, and that
yeah.
that's, again, the kind of looking from a different way of distancing yourself, raising this, or pointing out how absurd our perspectives are, and trying to make us question them that way.
So, is this a novel or is this an anti-novel?
How would you define what a novel should be?
Well,
What is the traditional definition of a novel?
traditional definition of a novel is it's a sustained work of prose fiction that achieves a kind of verisimilitude, a sense of what one critic, Ian Watt, called formal realism. And that doesn't mean that everything is believable. It means that everything is believable in its own context.
So it's consistent.
So it's consistent. So if you're in Middle-earth and there are elves, the elves act consistently, and wizards act consistently. So even though that's a fantasy, it's formally realistic because everything is believable within a certain context. And in many ways, of course, this is a novel. I think in some ways, what it's telling us is that sense of coherence is a fiction.
Yeah.
That sense of coherence is, that sense of formal realism is unrealistic. That you have to impose that, you have to impose both the time sequence on it, but probably even more importantly, the causal sequence, the causality that we accept in novels, in history, and in life, very, very simplistic explanations for very complicated, incoherent things. And we do that so we can feel better and sleep at night.
Yeah.
But when you really look at a complicated thing like the firebombing of Dresden, all of those attempts to make a simple meaning out of it look really stupid to the Tralfamadorians and probably should look stupid to us.
And I would go even farther than that, right? And say that the need to create meaning, which is really a need to connect cause and effect, is evolutionarily necessary, right? Because we are, in fact, trying to live in this world, and to live in this world means figuring out why that animal, that lion, one animal attacks people and eats people, and another one gets attacked and eaten by people, and there's all kinds of challenges and problems that we have to address in living in this world, and you need, therefore, to create cause and effect.
Right. And sometimes it's very real.
Sometimes it works.
You throw this spear, it punctures the animal's heart, the animal dies, cause and effect.
Yep.
It thunders, Thor is mad, he's lost his hammer,
Yep.
Doesn't quite work as well. But
And
we do them both.
that's right. And we have to do them because we have to have cause and effect in order to live. But we then tend to assume that everything has cause and effect.
Yeah.
And what Vonnegut is doing, and what Manchester talked about, is to try and make us recognize that the assumptions we necessarily make need to be questioned. And that's what the next book is going to do as well, right? Because we're going to move from World War II to Vietnam.
Yeah.
The things we carry. And that is maybe a novel and maybe not. And that is a book in which the narrator is maybe the author and maybe not. And it's going to kind of move logically in this kind of literary discussion between authors from Vonnegut to something that resembles Vonnegut but isn't.
Without the space aliens.
Yeah. Yes.
But with a lot of meta discussion, a lot of questioning of how memory and narrative work. Because that really is a novel or short story collection or something about a memory of combat more than it's about combat. And it's about how we use stories to make sense of the world. Okay, until next time, bye-bye.